Story 1. The Stray. A biting November wind swept through the quiet streets of White Hollow, a small Midwestern town. The skeletal branches of leafless trees clawed at the darkening sky, and the streetlights cast long shadows over deserted sidewalks. Ethan Miller hunched his shoulders against the cold, his breath misting in the air as he hurried up the steps to his modest two-story home. It had been a long shift at the hospital, and the only thing on his mind was collapsing into bed. Just as he pulled his keys from his pocket, he heard a sound, soft, faint, almost mournful. A meow. Ethan paused, hand poised over the doorknob, listening as the sound came again. He turned, his eyes scanning the dimly lit street, and there, at the edge of the sidewalk, sat a cat. Its coat was scraggly and matted, patches of white and black tangled in clumps. But it was the cat's eyes that gave him pause, one a sharp, piercing green, the other an intense amber. They seemed to gleam in the streetlight, almost unnaturally bright. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, feeling a strange compulsion to approach. The cat's eyes didn't waver, it sat perfectly still, staring at him as if waiting for something. Despite a flicker of unease, Ethan's sympathy won out. The poor thing looked half-starved, and the temperature was already dropping to dangerous levels. He couldn't just leave it out there. "All right," he muttered, taking a step back toward his door. "Come on. You can warm up inside for a bit." The cat didn't move, but its gaze followed him, unwavering. Ethan held the door open, and after a moment, the cat slinked forward, moving with an unnatural, almost predatory grace. It slipped past him into the hallway, its tail curling around its body as it took in its new surroundings. Ethan watched it cautiously, feeling that twinge of discomfort again. There was something off about the cat. He couldn't place it, but he felt it deep in his gut. Shaking off the feeling, he walked into the kitchen, opening a cabinet to grab a shallow dish and pouring some milk into it. "Here you go, buddy," he said, setting it on the floor in front of the cat. But the cat didn't so much as glance at the dish. Instead, it lifted its head, staring at him with those mismatched eyes, intense, unblinking. "Suit yourself," Ethan muttered, backing away. The cat's gaze followed him all the way out of the room. As he went about his nighttime routine, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he looked over his shoulder, there it was, the cat, sitting in the shadows, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. By the time he finished brushing his teeth, the hair on the back of his neck was standing up. He felt foolish, but he couldn't ignore the creeping sense of unease that had settled over him since he'd let the animal inside. Ethan shut the door to his bedroom, trying to push the thoughts out of his mind. It was just a cat, for crying out loud. He was being paranoid. But as he lay in bed, sleep eluding him, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic scratching coming from somewhere in the walls. At first, he thought it was the wind, branches scraping against the side of the house. But the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It was coming from inside. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The scratching seemed to be moving, traveling along the wall behind his bed, inching closer and closer. He held his breath, his gaze darting around the room, half expecting to see the cat materialize in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the soft, persistent scratching. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted off into a fitful sleep, haunted by visions of shadows slinking through his house, clawed fingers scraping against the walls. The next morning, Ethan found the cat sitting on the kitchen counter, staring at him with its piercing, unblinking eyes. The dish of milk was untouched. "You're a weird one, aren't you?" he muttered, brushing crumbs off the counter. But the cat didn't move, didn't blink. It just sat there, watching him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in its gaze, something almost human. He tried to go about his day, but the sense of unease lingered. The cat followed him from room to room, silent as a shadow, its eyes fixed on him with a disconcerting intensity. Whenever he turned around, it was there, watching, waiting. That night, the scratching sounds returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around him, closing in. Ethan lay rigid in bed, clutching the covers as the sounds grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to claw its way out of the walls. He could feel the weight of the cat's gaze on him, even though he had closed the bedroom door. At one point, the scratching stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as he lay there, waiting, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Just when he thought the silence would drive him mad, he heard it, a soft, low meow coming from the foot of his bed. He sat up slowly, peering into the darkness, and there it was, the cat, perched on the edge of the bed, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. He hadn't heard the door open. He hadn't seen it come in. It was just there, staring at him with that unsettling gaze. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The cat didn't respond. It just sat there, watching him, unblinking. The following weeks. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's life became a waking nightmare. The cat was always there, always watching, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing day. The scratching in the walls grew louder, more frantic, and he began to hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices trapped behind the walls. He tried to get rid of the cat, but no matter what he did, it always found its way back inside. He would lock it out at night, only to find it sitting at the foot of his bed in the morning, its eyes fixed on him with that cold, unyielding stare. He even drove it to the edge of town and left it by the side of the road, but by the time he returned home, the cat was waiting for him on the front porch, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. Ethan's friends began to notice his deteriorating appearance. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale and clammy, his once clean house now filled with scratch marks and shredded furniture. He tried to explain the situation to them, but no one believed him. They all said the same thing: "It's just a cat." But Ethan knew better. It wasn't just a cat. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent, something that had chosen him. The final night. On the final night, the scratching was so loud it drowned out all other sounds. The walls shook, the lights flickered, and Ethan could feel the weight of the cat's gaze pressing down on him like a physical force. He cowered in the corner of his bedroom, covering his ears as the walls seemed to pulse and shudder, as if something was trying to break through. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. Ethan opened his eyes, his breath hitching in his throat as he took in the silence. The room was dark, the only light coming from the cat's eyes, gleaming in the darkness like twin flames. The cat padded forward, its gaze never leaving his, and Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. He tried to move, to scream, but he was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as the cat came closer and closer, its eyes burning into his soul. And then, in a voice as soft as a whisper, he heard it. "I have come for you." The cat's mouth opened, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, and the darkness seemed to close in around him, swallowing him whole. Epilogue. Days later, Ethan's friends grew concerned when they couldn't reach him. When they finally broke down the door, they found his house empty, his belongings untouched. The only sign of life was a cat, a scraggly, black and white creature with one green eye and one amber, sitting in the middle of the living room, staring at them with an unblinking gaze. The cat eventually slinked out the door and disappeared into the night, leaving White Hollow in search of its next home. And somewhere, far away, a young man would soon hear a faint meow echoing in the cold November wind. Story 2. The Warning. Days passed, and the cat seemed to settle in. At least, that's what Ethan tried to tell himself as he moved through his house with growing unease. At first, the cat's presence had been unsettling yet manageable. But as the days went by, Ethan noticed things about the cat that he couldn't explain, nor could he easily ignore. The cat had a peculiar ability to disappear at will. One moment, it would be perched on the kitchen counter, tail wrapped neatly around its paws, its intense mismatched eyes fixed on him. But when he looked away, just for a second, it would vanish, leaving behind only the faintest impression that it had ever been there at all. It wasn't like a regular cat hiding under furniture or darting around corners. It was as though it dissolved into thin air, slipping into some unseen shadowy realm that lay just beyond his sight. Ethan tried to convince himself he was just imagining it. Maybe it was stress, he thought, after too many late nights at the hospital. But the strange happenings began to escalate, and he found it harder and harder to brush them off. One evening, Ethan was washing dishes, the hot water steaming up the window in front of him. He scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a pan, his mind wandering to the unsettling events of the past few days, the vanishing cat, the scratching sounds, and those piercing eyes that seemed to follow him everywhere. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the fog forming on the glass until he glanced up. And there, scrawled in jagged letters across the window, were the words, "Beware." Ethan froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The letters had been written from the inside, the condensation smeared and dripping, as though an invisible hand had just traced them moments before. He spun around, his eyes darting across the room. No one else was there. The house was silent, empty. But then he saw it, the cat, sitting at the edge of the table, its gaze locked on him, unblinking, intense. Its mismatched eyes seemed almost amused, as if it knew something he didn't. He blinked, and when he looked back at the window, the writing was gone, the glass clear as if it had never been touched. His hands shook as he clutched the edge of the sink, trying to steady himself. What the hell?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. The cat cocked its head, its eyes gleaming with a dark, inscrutable intelligence. For a moment, Ethan felt an overwhelming urge to reach out to it, to place his hand on its fur, as if somehow that contact might dispel the fear knotting in his chest. But something stopped him, a primal, instinctive warning that roared in his mind, "Don't touch it." Ignoring the cat's gaze, Ethan hurried to his bedroom and locked the door, determined to put as much distance between himself and the strange animal as possible. Signs and shadows. Over the next few days, the warnings continued. He would find mirrors fogged up with vague, half-formed words, smears that looked like symbols he couldn't decipher. The walls began to bear strange marks, faint scratches and patterns that reminded him of symbols from old folklore books. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, filling corners where they shouldn't be, lingering like silent watchers. The house was changing, growing darker, and Ethan could feel it closing in on him. He spent hours poring over online forums and old books, searching for answers to the strange occurrences. His exhaustion grew, and he began avoiding sleep, afraid of what he might see, or not see, when he closed his eyes. One evening, Ethan was sitting at his desk, scrolling through pages on local legends and folklore, when a soft thud echoed from the hallway. His blood went cold. He knew he was alone in the house. He gripped his phone tightly, inching out of the room and peering down the darkened hallway. There, in the dim light, he saw it. The cat sat in the middle of the hallway, one paw raised, as if it had been scratching at the wall. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, pinning him in place with their unnatural intensity. A part of him wanted to flee, to throw open the front door and never look back. But something stronger held him there, a morbid curiosity, a desperate need to understand what was happening. Slowly, he approached the cat, his breath shallow and quick. The closer he got, the stronger the feeling grew, a deep, crawling sense of dread, as if he were walking into a trap. And then he saw the wall behind the cat, the faint symbols etched into the plaster, their shapes twisted and warped. What are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to the cat. The cat blinked, slow and deliberate, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something else in its gaze, something ancient, something that had seen things beyond his comprehension. It was then that Ethan realized the truth: this was no ordinary cat. It was a messenger, a creature caught between worlds, carrying something dark and dangerous into his life. And it was here with a purpose. The visitor. The following night, Ethan woke to the sound of scratching again, only this time, it was louder, more insistent, as if something were trying to break through the walls. He lay in bed, paralyzed, listening as the sound grew closer and closer, until it was right beside him. He bolted upright, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent now, the scratching gone. But when he glanced to the foot of his bed, he saw it, the cat, sitting there, watching him with that same unnerving gaze. He couldn't take it anymore. Scrambling out of bed, he grabbed his phone and called his friend Mark, a local historian and one of the few people he trusted. Mark was groggy but agreed to come over, sensing the urgency in Ethan's voice. When Mark arrived, he looked around the house, noting the strange marks on the walls and the shadows that seemed to linger in every corner. He listened as Ethan explained the bizarre occurrences, the messages, the vanishing cat. After a moment of silence, Mark frowned. "There's an old story around here, about a spirit animal, a cat that appears to people who are marked for something." "Marked?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. Mark nodded. "It's said that the cat carries the spirit of a vengeful soul. It chooses people, haunts them, and when the time comes, well, they disappear." Ethan's face paled. "Disappear? What does that mean?" "No one knows," Mark said grimly. "But those who see the cat are said to be chosen for something beyond our understanding. It's not just a haunting, Ethan. It's a warning. The last message." Ethan couldn't sleep after Mark left. He felt like a prisoner in his own home, every shadow and whisper a reminder of the danger lurking within his walls. He watched the cat, waiting for it to appear, every fiber of his being alert and tense. It was nearly dawn when he saw it again, this time, in his bathroom mirror. He had gone to splash cold water on his face, trying to shake the exhaustion, when he looked up and saw the cat sitting on the counter behind him, its eyes boring into his reflection. But it wasn't alone. Beside the cat, he saw the faint outline of a figure, a shadowy, twisted form, barely visible in the dim light. It had no distinct features, just an amorphous shape, like a wraith hovering in the periphery of his vision. Ethan stumbled back, knocking over the soap dispenser as he tried to steady himself. He stared at the mirror, his mind racing. And then, as he watched, another message appeared, scrawled in dripping, crimson letters across the glass. "You are mine." A chill ran down his spine, and he backed out of the bathroom, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He stumbled into the living room, desperate to escape, to get as far from the cat and that haunting message as possible. But when he looked up, he froze. The cat was there, sitting in the middle of the room, its eyes gleaming like fire. And behind it, he saw the shadow again, looming larger, its twisted form reaching out toward him. He could feel his body growing colder, his mind slipping into a dark fog as the cat's eyes held him captive. His vision blurred, and he felt himself being pulled into the shadows, into a place where the lines between the living and the dead were blurred. The last thing he heard was a soft, mocking purr as the darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole. Epilogue. When his friends finally broke into the house days later, they found it empty, his belongings scattered but untouched. The only sign of life was a single, scraggly black and white cat sitting in the living room, its mismatched eyes gleaming in the dim light. It sat there, silent and still, until it rose, stretching, and slipped out the open door, disappearing into the morning mist. Somewhere else, in another quiet Midwestern town, a man heard a faint meow outside his window, just as he was about to lock up for the night. Story 3. Midnight Visitor. Ethan's dreams had always been vivid, but these nightmares were different. They clawed at him with an intensity that left him drenched in sweat, his heart pounding long after he jolted awake. In these dreams, he was trapped in his own house, his safe haven transformed into a labyrinth of terror. Shadows crawled across the walls, growing thicker and darker, consuming every inch of his surroundings. He would try to run, desperate to escape, but no matter where he went, the shadow would grow, looming larger, swallowing him bit by bit. Each time, just before the darkness engulfed him completely, he would wake up, gasping for air, his sheets tangled around him. And every time, without fail, he found the cat sitting at the foot of his bed, its mismatched eyes trained on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It was as if the cat were guarding him, or worse, observing him, studying his every reaction. One night, after an especially vivid nightmare, he awoke to find the cat's face mere inches from his own. He could feel its breath, warm and damp, brushing against his skin. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, and he could see his own terrified reflection staring back at him in their depths. It had never been this close before. What do you want?" he whispered, his voice barely a tremor in the dark. For a moment, the cat was silent, its eyes unblinking, its expression unreadable. Then, it made a sound Ethan had never heard before, a low, guttural hiss that vibrated through the room, sending a chill down his spine. It was a sound filled with malice, a warning that struck him to his core. Before he could react, the cat turned and padded out of the room, leaving him shaken and alone in the darkness. The spiral of fear. After that night, Ethan's nightmares grew worse, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. The shadow in his dreams seemed to be alive, pulsating with a sinister energy that felt almost tangible. Sometimes, he could swear he felt it breathing, could hear its whispers, faint and taunting, just beyond the edge of his consciousness. During the day, he became increasingly paranoid, jumping at every sound, his nerves frayed to the breaking point. He could no longer tell if the strange occurrences in his house were real or if his mind was unraveling under the weight of fear. The cat was always there, lurking in the corners, its eyes following him with an unnerving intensity. No matter where he went, he could feel its gaze, piercing and relentless. One evening, as he was washing his face in the bathroom, he glanced up and saw the cat's reflection in the mirror. It was sitting on the counter behind him, its eyes locked onto his. But something was different this time. In the mirror's dim reflection, he could see a faint, shadowy figure standing just behind the cat, a twisted form with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. He spun around, heart racing, but the shadow was gone. The cat, however, remained, its expression inscrutable. He staggered back, clutching the edge of the sink as he struggled to catch his breath. Was he losing his mind? Or was something else, something far darker and more insidious, taking hold of him? The midnight visitor returns. One night, as he lay in bed, trying to fight off the inevitable descent into another nightmare, he heard a soft creak from somewhere in the house. His entire body tensed, his breath hitching as he strained to listen. The house was silent, every creak and groan amplified in the darkness. And then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic padding sound, like footsteps, moving slowly down the hallway toward his room. Ethan's pulse quickened, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss it as his imagination, a product of his sleep-deprived brain. But the footsteps continued, drawing closer and closer, until they stopped just outside his bedroom door. He held his breath, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. For a moment, there was silence. And then, slowly, the door creaked open, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A soft shadow shifted at the doorway, and then the cat appeared, slipping silently into the room. It padded over to the foot of his bed, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, the shadow entered, a dark, amorphous shape that seemed to seep into the room like smoke, filling every corner with a suffocating darkness. It towered over the bed, a shapeless mass of darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe, as though it were alive. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body was frozen, his muscles locked in place as he stared up at the shadow, his mind screaming in terror. The cat sat at the foot of the bed, watching him, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light, as if it were enjoying his fear. The shadow moved closer, its darkness pressing down on him, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. He could feel its cold, clammy touch against his skin, could hear its faint whispers, like the voices of the dead echoing in his mind. And then, just as he thought he would be consumed by the darkness, the shadow stopped, pulling back just enough for him to breathe. "Leave," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, leave me alone." The cat tilted its head, its eyes gleaming with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it rose, padding over to the shadow. It sat beside it, the two forms blending together until they were indistinguishable, a single entity of darkness and malice. And then, just as silently as it had come, the shadow retreated, slipping out of the room, leaving behind only the faint echo of its presence. The cat lingered for a moment, watching him with those haunting eyes, before it, too, turned and padded out of the room. Ethan lay there, gasping for air, his mind reeling. He could feel the darkness lingering in the air, a cold, oppressive weight that pressed down on him, filling him with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. A desperate plea. The next morning, Ethan called Mark again, his voice barely a whisper as he recounted the events of the night before. He could hear the concern in Mark's voice, the disbelief mixed with a growing sense of alarm. "You need to get out of there, Ethan," Mark said firmly. "Whatever this is, it's not natural. It's feeding off your fear, your energy. You need to leave that house before it's too late." Ethan wanted to argue, to tell him that it was just a cat, that he was being ridiculous. But deep down, he knew that Mark was right. Whatever was happening in that house was beyond his understanding, beyond anything he had ever encountered before. He spent the day packing his belongings, moving through the house with a sense of urgency. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. As he was packing his last box, he heard it, a soft, low hiss, coming from the doorway. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw the cat sitting there, its eyes fixed on him with a look of pure, unadulterated malice. It hissed again, the sound low and guttural, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He backed away, his hands shaking, and the cat took a step forward, its eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. He turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He could hear the cat's footsteps behind him, soft and relentless, following him as he fled. When he reached the front door, he fumbled with the lock, his hands trembling as he tried to open it. But the door wouldn't budge, as if some invisible force were holding it shut. He turned, his back pressed against the door, and saw the cat sitting at the bottom of the stairs, its eyes fixed on him with a look that sent a shiver of terror through his body. And then he saw it, the shadow, emerging from the darkness, filling the hallway with its cold, suffocating presence. It loomed over him, its form twisting and writhing, a living embodiment of his deepest fears. Ethan felt his mind slipping, his vision blurring as the darkness closed in around him. The cat's eyes were the last thing he saw, their gleaming intensity searing into his mind as the shadow swallowed him whole. Epilogue. When his friends arrived the next morning, the house was empty. Ethan's belongings were packed, stacked neatly by the door, but there was no sign of him. The only thing they found was a single, scraggly black and white cat sitting on the front porch, its mismatched eyes gleaming with an eerie intelligence. It watched them as they searched the house, its gaze cold and calculating. And when they finally gave up and left, the cat rose, stretching languidly before slipping into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. Somewhere, in another quiet town, a faint meow echoed in the night, and a shadow shifted, waiting patiently for its next visitor. Story 4. Ethan's life had spiraled into a waking nightmare, each day blending into the next as he grappled with the escalating horrors surrounding the strange cat. What had started as faint sounds and strange dreams had transformed into something he could no longer rationalize. Scratches had started appearing everywhere. At first, it was on his walls, a few faint marks here and there, as if someone had dragged a claw across the surface. Then he found them on his furniture, his couch shredded as if by tiny, furious claws. But the worst part was when the scratches began appearing on his skin. He'd wake up in the morning with thin red lines on his arms, his chest, even his face. They were shallow but unmistakably deliberate, as if something, or someone, had been marking him in his sleep. The idea made his skin crawl. He would have sworn he locked his bedroom door each night. He'd checked the cat, but it was never in his room when he awoke. And no matter how he tried to piece together an explanation, nothing made sense. One night, after a particularly brutal dream where the shadow had chased him through an endless maze, he awoke with a set of claw marks across his shoulder, raw and stinging. He'd had enough. In a frenzy of frustration and fear, he found the cat lounging in the living room, watching him with those eerie, unblinking eyes. "I'm done with this," he muttered, his voice shaking as he scooped up the cat, its body warm but unnervingly still in his hands. He marched to the bathroom and set it down inside, slamming the door shut. just to be sure, he locked it, testing the handle twice before retreating back to his bedroom. He needed one night of uninterrupted sleep, one night where he didn't wake up with scratches on his skin and shadows looming over him. As he crawled into bed, a sense of uneasy relief washed over him. With the cat locked away, maybe he could finally rest. But that relief was short-lived. The next morning, Ethan's eyes shot open as a feeling of dread washed over him. He stumbled out of bed, making his way to the bathroom with an anxious sense of urgency. As he reached the bathroom door, his heart dropped. The door was wide open. He was certain he had locked it. He'd double-checked. But now, it hung open as if he'd never touched it. A chill crept over him as he stepped inside. There, on the mirror, was a message. Written in jagged, scratchy red letters, as if carved with claws, were the words, "I am here to stay." Ethan's stomach twisted. He backed away, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The letters seemed to pulse, fresh and raw, as though they had just been carved into the glass. His hand flew to his mouth to stifle a scream. He took a shaky breath and scanned the bathroom, his eyes falling on the cat, which sat in the corner, its eyes fixed on him with a glint that was both knowing and menacing. Its tail flicked lazily back and forth, as if it were amused by his horror, reveling in his fear. Those mismatched eyes, one green, one amber, bored into him, filled with a malevolent intelligence that he could no longer deny. You're not normal," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What are you?" The cat didn't answer, of course, but it held his gaze, unblinking, as if it understood every word. The air around him felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He backed out of the bathroom, his heart pounding as he tried to think of what to do next. He had no idea what he was dealing with, but he knew he was in over his head. His mind flashed to Mark, the only person who had believed even a fraction of his story. He grabbed his phone and dialed, his fingers shaking as he waited for the line to connect. "Ethan?" Mark's voice crackled through the speaker, groggy and confused. "Mark. I need your help," Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. This thing, whatever it is, it's not just a cat. There's something wrong. It's scratching me in my sleep, leaving messages. It's like it's trying to claim this place." Mark was silent for a moment before he replied, his voice low and cautious. "Ethan, I told you to get out of that house. This isn't natural. Whatever that cat is, it's not just an animal." Ethan glanced back at the bathroom, where the cat still sat, watching him with those burning eyes. "I don't know what to do, Mark. It's like it's got some kind of hold on me. I tried locking it up, but it got out. I don't know how." There was a pause, and then Mark's voice came through, firm and unyielding. "Listen to me, Ethan. Whatever you do, don't look into its eyes. They say that spirits, entities, whatever this thing is, they can get a hold of you through eye contact. It's like an invitation." Ethan swallowed hard, the realization settling over him like a weight. He'd been staring into those eyes every day, feeling that strange, hypnotic pull each time. Maybe that was how it had been able to manipulate him, to dig its claws deeper into his life. "Get out of there, Ethan. Don't let it trap you," Mark urged. Ethan nodded, though he knew Mark couldn't see him. He turned, his eyes skimming over the cat without making direct contact. The creature's gaze still bore into. Story 5. The truth. Ethan had reached his breaking point. His nights were plagued by nightmares, his days haunted by strange occurrences that defied all logic. Scratches, voices, messages carved in the walls, it was all too much. Desperate for answers, he called a local historian, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was some explanation in the town's history that could help him make sense of the horrors unfolding in his own home. The historian's voice on the other end of the line was calm, with a practiced neutrality that hinted at many tales heard over the years. But when Ethan described the cat with mismatched eyes and the strange, haunting events, he could hear the man's breath catch. There was a pause before the historian finally spoke, his voice tinged with an ominous understanding. "Are you familiar with the town's old legends, Mr. Miller?" the historian asked cautiously. "No, I never paid much attention to that sort of thing," Ethan admitted, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. The historian continued, his voice lower now, as if unwilling to be overheard. "Well, there's one story that seems eerily similar to what you're describing. It's one of those local legends people don't really talk about anymore. But back in the late 1800s, there was a series of strange disappearances in our town. People vanished without a trace, often from inside locked rooms, with no sign of forced entry or struggle. The only connection between these cases was a cat." Ethan's skin prickled as he listened. "A cat?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the historian replied. "Witnesses claim to have seen a scraggly black and white cat with mismatched eyes, one green, one amber, around the homes of those who disappeared. It became a ghost story, something to scare children. People whispered that it wasn't a normal cat, but rather a spirit, a vengeful soul, cursed to roam from household to household, feeding on fear and misfortune. Some believe it carries the essence of a person who died unjustly, a lost soul bent on revenge." Ethan's stomach churned, dread settling deep within him. The historian continued, "They say it can enter any home, no matter the locks or walls that try to keep it out. That it won't leave until it has taken what it wants. And once it's chosen its target, there's no escaping it." Ethan felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The historian's words hung heavy in the air, filling him with a sense of inevitability. This was no ordinary haunting. Whatever this creature was, it had already laid claim to him. But Ethan wasn't ready to give in. That night, he made a desperate attempt to rid himself of the cat. He could still hear Mark's words ringing in his ears, "Don't look it in the eyes. Don't let it trap you." Armed with newfound determination, he devised a plan. He coaxed the cat outside, refusing to meet its gaze as he set it down on the front step. Its body felt strangely cold in his hands, like holding a block of ice wrapped in fur. Ethan hurriedly locked the door behind him and went around the house, checking every window, securing every possible entry point. He double-checked each lock, his heart pounding as he finished the final circuit of the house. Finally, he exhaled, feeling a glimmer of relief for the first time in weeks. But when he turned back toward the living room, his breath caught in his throat. There it was. Sitting on the couch as if it had never left, the cat was there, staring at him with a look that bordered on amused disdain. Its eyes, one green, one amber, seemed brighter than ever, glowing like embers in the darkened room. Ethan's heart raced as he backed away, his mind reeling with fear and disbelief. "No, you can't be here," he stammered, his voice a broken whisper. But the cat only watched him, its eyes glinting with an otherworldly intelligence. And then, for the first time since it had come into his life, the cat opened its mouth wide, revealing a set of sharp, glistening teeth that seemed to stretch impossibly long, glinting in the dim light. Its mouth opened wider and wider, an endless abyss filled with jagged points that seemed to hunger for more than mere flesh. Ethan stumbled backward, feeling his legs weaken beneath him as the room seemed to grow darker, shadows gathering in the corners, creeping along the walls. It was as though the very air had thickened, pressing in around him, suffocating him as the darkness took shape, swirling and pulsating like a living entity. The shadows reached out, tendrils of blackness coiling around his limbs, holding him in place as the cat rose, its mouth still stretched open in that impossibly wide, grotesque grin. Ethan struggled, gasping for air, but the shadows only tightened, pulling him deeper into their cold, suffocating embrace. The last thing he saw was the cat's eyes, those gleaming mismatched orbs that burned with a hunger older than time itself. And then, as the darkness closed in around him, he felt himself slipping, his very essence being drawn into the depths, consumed by the shadows that had plagued him for so long. Epilogue. When Mark came to check on Ethan the next day, the house was empty. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. Ethan's belongings were in place, undisturbed, as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The only thing Mark found was a single, solitary cat sitting on the front porch, watching him with unblinking eyes, one green, one amber. It was scraggly and thin, its fur matted, but there was a look in its gaze that chilled Mark to the bone. He took a step back, his heart pounding as the cat continued to watch him, its tail flicking slowly, almost tauntingly. He could feel the weight of its gaze, an invisible pressure that seemed to seep into his very bones. Without a word, he turned and left, feeling the cat's eyes on him until he was well down the street. When he glanced back, the cat was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. Weeks later, in a nearby town, a new family found a scraggly black and white cat waiting on their doorstep. It was small, thin, and seemed harmless enough. They let it inside, thinking it looked hungry, a stray in need of care. But as the nights wore on, strange things began to happen. Scratches appeared on the walls, faint whispers echoed in the darkness, and shadows seemed to grow longer, creeping closer and closer with each passing night. And the cat watched, its mismatched eyes gleaming in the dark, waiting patiently for the next victim to fall into its trap. If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.